Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, came out in the 1970s. PETA came around in 1980. So groups and advocates have been at this for decades. And yet the percentage of people in the United States who are vegetarian has basically not changed at all. So it really is time for us to reconsider our message, reconsider our advocacy, and do something that has a chance of being different, that has a chance of breaking through to the general public. Because we know, just by looking at the graphs, just by looking at the numbers, that we have been failures at this so far.
In veganism in 2017, I would say that the more political you are, the more explicitly and overtly political you are in your approach to veganism, the more optimistic you are. And this is brought to my mind by recent challenges to vegans I've seen by Reducetarians and recent responses of veganism against the newly organized voice of Reducetarianism. So in Reducetarianism, I think the word almost began as a joke. But this year we've seen formal conferences of Reducetarians, and we've seen people, including ex-vegans or people who are vegan but who were ex-vegan activists, saying that they're switching to a Reducetarian approach. There's one guy who got 800,000 views on a video on YouTube. I can provide a link below. He has a website and some kind of organization called One Step for Animals.
Everyone has met a vegan who has been rude to them or who has been, outrageous or just angry or yelling at them. We are driving people away. We are driving people back to eating meat.
I think he is vegan personally, but he gave up on vegan activism because he thinks it's ineffective, he thinks it's a failed paradigm, and he's instead now advocating a form of Reducetarianism.
What some friends and I decided is we should take a different approach. Rather than just pushing veganism, we should take the opportunity that people have to take one step that will have a profound impact on the number of animals suffering.
Now, this is an interesting challenge for vegans to respond to, and I think it's very instructive to see how someone like Gary Francione struggles to respond to the competitive answer offered by Reducetarianism, the competitive solution to the same set of problems. Reducetarians will frequently offer arguments along these lines. They will claim that it is better to have 10,000 people who are 50% vegan, who are reducing their meat consumption by 50%, who are vegan 50%, that will have more of an impact than having just 1,000 people who are 100% vegan, who are perfectly disciplined, who are highly in their own lifestyle habits, consumption, what have you. And of course, if you're just measuring the impact in aggregate on the number of animals being slaughtered, the amount of water being used or other resources being used, of course, there's a simple mathematical sense in which that's true. And I do think that other vegan leaders like Gary Francione have trouble addressing that. And I do think that some vegans are going to be seduced, so to speak, to come over to the Reducetarian side, whether or not they themselves go back to eating meat. That what they advocate, what they preach, and how they conduct outreach, how they reach out to meat eaters, they may start to frame their engagement in their discourse in terms of Reducetarianism rather than asking for people to get engaged with, the core ethical concept of veganism, to adjust their own lifestyles to reflect that so-called moral baseline. It's Gary Francione's favorite term. So some of the questions are about effectiveness. Some of the questions are about the past failures of veganism. Some of the questions get framed in terms of the psychological perception of vegans themselves, vegans being perceived as a threat by meat eaters. This video that had over 800,000 views, it certainly states the problem as being that veganism itself is somehow too challenging or too offensive. They show video clips of a specific vegan activist group called DXE, Direct Action Everywhere, in contrast to how supposedly nice and friendly Reducetarianism is as an agenda. Anyway, this is misleading in a number of ways, including the fact that ultimately Reducetarians are still telling people that eating meat is bad and evil and wrong. They're just proposing a different solution or a different way to mitigate the damage and evils of the industry. They're just not proposing veganism. They're proposing that you eat less meat rather than zero, but actually the type of confrontations involved will be similar. It's interesting to note that these two groups, so one is called One Step for Animals, and the other is called Direct Action Everywhere. I have a playlist for them. I have quite a few videos commenting Direct Action Everywhere. One Step for Animals fundamentally is based in a sense of frustration, of pessimism, that veganism as a movement is failed or is failing, that it has been a failure, that decades and decades of animal rights activism has sort of come to nothing, that only 2% of people are vegan, which is a very generous estimate, by the way. I think in reality, fewer than 2% of people are vegan. But anyway, a tiny, tiny minority of people are vegan, and that the movement is going nowhere, whereas there's this supposedly untapped potential of reducetarianism to really change the world, to really impact, to really mitigate how much meat people are eating.
Around 2% of people are true vegetarians. There have been a number of studies, the most recent by Faunalytics, that shows over 80% of people who go vegetarian go back to eating animals. And almost half of the people surveyed on this say that they go back because they can't stand the pressure to maintain a pure diet. And so when we're pushing people to eat the way we eat, we are driving people away. We are driving people back to eating meat.
But this guy took on this direction where he's just asking people to quit eating chicken, not beef, not fish. Oddly, where he's just tackling the ethics of how chicken is produced and to ask people to stop eating chicken, and he's taking a reducetarian approach rather than a pro-vegan approach out of frustration. And on the other hand, we can say that the group he's contrasting himself to, at least in this one video, where he's saying that vegans have this negative and combative and rude and insulting impact on people, he's contrasting himself to Direct Action Everywhere. Direct Action Everywhere and their unique method of protest and social engagement, they call disruptive activism, but they use the term disruption. That also was entirely founded and defined in terms of frustration with the mode of vegan activism they had been engaged in before that they thought wasn't working. Specifically, the founder, Wayne Seong, he had been handing out cookies and pamphlets and inviting people to come to documentary film nights, especially on university campuses. And after some number of years of doing this, he sat down and did the math, and he said this is a huge amount of effort with very little outcome. And his frustration with that led him in another direction. So they're both examples of how frustration with what you recognize is not working in vegan activism can lead you to ask new questions, find new answers, take on new directions and new methods. It is what it is. In this case, I think both responses are wrong. And the challenge posed by reducetarianism itself, I think, leads us to take on new directions, ask new questions, etc. I think I'm fundamentally more optimistic than any of these people, and I'm fundamentally more optimistic than Gary Francione when I see him wrestling with reducetarians, because I really believe in the agency of the people involved. I believe in the political agency of small groups of people getting organized. And if you want a great example of that, somewhat terrifying example, you can look at the history of how in the United States of America, a small number of housewives managed to make alcohol illegal. This is the era that's called Prohibition. If you look at a full copy of the United States Constitution, read the Constitution from beginning to end. This is not just a law. This is a constitutional amendment to make alcohol illegal in the United States. And it's still in there. It's still in the Constitution. And then there's a later amendment that revises it, almost gets rid of it. There's still a few counties in America where alcohol is illegal. A small number of opinionated, highly organized people with a highly unpopular opinion. I mean, the vast majority of Americans did not want alcohol to become illegal in the United States. But this minority of people made it happen, not just as a law, not just as a government policy, but as a constitutional amendment. Now, in some ways, that's a positive example. In some ways, that's a negative example. But it is remarkable. It's very well documented for history. This was a time when women are considered relatively oppressed and voiceless. But these were actually predominantly women's groups that agitated for, got organized, and pressed for this legal amendment. That was, by and large, a disaster. But they changed the law, and they imposed their views and their opinions on the majority. That's supposed to be a rare and unknown thing in Western capitalist democracies, but it happens. Why? Just because they thought it was the right thing to do. Just because they thought they had a moral argument for temperance, as they called it. Not drinking much alcohol, reducetarianism, or not drinking alcohol at all. Now, there are other more moderate examples with more durable impacts. But I like to draw people's attention to the fact that a very, very small percentage of Americans ever cared about seatbelts, about making seatbelts mandatory in cars. There's a specific political figure called Ralph Nader, who's also remembered for his environmental advocacy and running for president of the United States. But Ralph Nader originally became famous in the United States. He made his name by going around and lobbying on this issue that every car should have seatbelts. And at the time, they didn't. What percentage of Americans do you think really cared about passing laws to force car companies to have seatbelts? Do you think it was 1%? Do you think it was 2%? Do you think it was 5%? Now, passively, maybe 50% of Americans could recognize that, yeah, using seatbelts would be a good thing to do, no harm, at least it does some good, etc., right? Well, there's a further element here of coercion, having laws that force people to use seatbelts as individuals, not just the automotive companies, but people to wear seatbelts, and that threaten you with a fine or a day in jail or something if you're riding around with no seatbelt on. So there are elements of personal inconvenience. There are elements of coercion and what have you, not just inconvenience for the automotive company. And the United States of America, like many Western democracies, went through a kind of strange process of courting public opinion and of small lobby groups courting government, of public influence and private interest being balanced. And in the end, most Western democracies have made seatbelts a universal requirement of cars and have made them mandatory for drivers, if not drivers and passengers, to be wearing seatbelts at all times. Now, again, my fundamental point is not that 99% of people were opposed to seatbelts and only 1% of people wanted them and cared. It's not the case at all. Probably less than 1% of people really cared about that issue passionately, either which way. The vast majority of people were indifferent to it. And that's the situation veganism is in. It's not the case that the vast majority of meat eaters hate and revile veganism, or hate our ecological arguments, hate our health-based arguments, or hate the animal rights arguments. The vast majority of people are not anti-vegan. They are just absolutely, fundamentally indifferent, in the same way that they would be indifferent to seatbelts. And probably they'd shrug their shoulders and say, oh, you're going to do something good for the environment? Okay. Oh, you're going to do something good for human health? Okay. Oh, you're going to do something good for animal rights or for animals in some sense? This is really the contest and the situation we're in. And why I regard reducetarianism so differently. The reducetarian argument, again, 10,000 people who are 50% vegan are going to have more of an impact, in the reducetarians claim, than just 100 people who are 100% vegan. My view is the exact opposite, because what we don't need are 1,000 people who are wishy-washy or indifferent. What we need are small groups of people, 100 people here, 100 people there, who are highly organized, highly able to lobby government, highly able to influence public policy decisions. 100 people who are all 100% vegan, if they show up at the school board, any school board, 100 people have a big impact in the school board. School boards in Canada will respond to a few dozen people who are members of a small ethnic minority, a small religious minority. You have a group like the Sikhs, you have a group like the Yazidis, you have various small religious groups in some suburb of Toronto, and they'll show up and they will lobby the school board and say, look, these are our concerns about what is or isn't in the curriculum, how they are or aren't represented or something, or about the problems their own students are having due to religious observances or religious holidays or whatever it is. You would be surprised. A few dozen people can influence a local school board. If you have 100 vegans who are really consistently and in a way that's logical and moral and respectable and so on, showing up at the school board and saying, look, what you're teaching about milk, this is scientifically false. What you're teaching about eggs, about eating chicken eggs, this is scientifically false, and this is based on propaganda produced by these industries. And if you're going to adopt this, then why shouldn't we teach that cigarettes are healthy? You think 100 people who are 100% vegan can't have an impact on a school board, on a local mayor level government? We had an example of that, Berkeley, California, of Berkeley making fur illegal to buy and sell fur, but not leather. Interestingly. So, a local city government taking up that ordinance for ethical grounds because of the number of vegans who now live in Berkeley, California, which includes direct action everywhere, by the way. I think Wayne Seung himself is now living in Berkeley, California. Now, again, some vegans are against that kind of single-issue cause lobbying and so on. But with all those digressions aside, fundamentally, I'm reminded of my own optimism about veganism as a movement, my optimism for the future, by these conflicts between vegans and reducetarians, these questions about effective activism that go on within the movement to some extent are stealing people away from the movement to take on new and different tactics and approaches, because I believe that small groups of people can make a big difference, can make a big impact. But those small groups of people can't be 50% vegan or 50% reducetarian. They kind of sort of care some of the time. What you need are groups of people who are highly committed, highly disciplined, in terms of the time they're willing to put in, whether that's at City Hall or at the school board, or maybe it's a conservation-based group that involves a particular river, a particular forest, etc. All those things take a lot of time and energy. And I can't imagine those being built on people who have a wishy-washy commitment to veganism, where they know it's wrong and they know it's bad, but they're still willing to buy a leather couch, or they're still willing to eat meat a couple of times a year. That future and that kind of organization absolutely has to be based on a type of commitment above and beyond merely maintaining a 100% vegan diet. So that's what I have to say. I think the more overtly political you are in veganism in 2017, the more optimistic you're going to be, because you won't feel that we're a powerless minority of 1% adrift in the world, or a powerless minority of 2%, whatever statistic you want to use. You won't view the struggle of veganism as a hopeless struggle to try to get from 1% to 100%. That's not my struggle. And I don't see the struggle of veganism in terms of struggle to get, billions of animals being killed down to half as many billions of animals being killed. I don't see it in that way. I see it as a much more immediately attainable goal of organizing those groups of 10 people here and 100 people there that can have a big impact on specific issues, whether it's a specific school board, a specific river, a specific slaughterhouse, a specific racetrack, whatever that issue to tackle might be. That small numbers of people with high levels of commitment, high levels of self-discipline, hopefully high levels of education, can really have an impact in this world, especially when they have a cause that appeals to people's ethical sense of right and wrong. We've got a lot more going for us than the than the seatbelt movement ever did. Really, we do. This has a lot more weight. It has a lot more meaning in people's lives. We have a lot more going for us than the temperance movement ever did, that ended up with a disastrous example of the United States making alcohol illegal. But throughout history, small minorities, highly organized, can make a big impact, and we can too.